Okay, it looks like I can. So I'll go ahead and do it. Everyone, just FYI, we're just going to record the session so that we can post it on our website with all our other videos for other people to view later. So we're just going to be recording the session so other people have access, but please let us know if you have any questions or concerns.
Okay. Um, so like I said before, this session's all about the MCAT and just a bit of an overview. This is our second um, presentation. The upcoming ones are shown here. We won't have another one until the start of the new year, and that one will be on letters of recommendations um, and things like that. So if you got an email about this one, you'll get an email about the next ones as well that are coming up as we get closer to the opening of the next cycle. Um, so before we really get into the weeds of things, I want to say that the MCAT is just one part of your application. I know it seems super stressful to have to go through this test and like the world kind of rides on it. I remember feeling like that. What I like to say is that the MCAT is a necessary part of getting into medical school, but it's certainly not sufficient for you to get into medical school. Um, Certainly not having a great score um, can make it difficult to get in, but on the other side of that, if someone has an incredible MCAT score, but a bad personal statement, not great volunteer experiences, and things like that, that's also very bad. So before we kind of talk about this test for the next hour and how hard it is and all these things, just know that it's not the end all be all for getting into medical school. And like I think the application, once it's all done, is like 17 pages long. That your MCAT score is literally like 5 lines of it, just to put it into perspective. So just remember that as we talk about this. Um, so just a little overview of the MCAT. It is a marathon. It's 7.5 hours long, including breaks, and about 6 hours and 15 minutes with actual content. And it's broken into 4 sections. Those 4 sections are chemical and physical foundations, critical analysis and reasoning, also called CARS, and then bio and biochem, and lastly, psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. And on the graph on the right, you can kind of see the breakdown of exactly um, the sort of information that you're going to need to know and things like that. I would say that the 2 sections that are the most sort of discrete and contained are cars. That one is mostly having passages that you read and answering questions on them. All of the information and all of the answers will always be in those passages. And then psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior is also very discrete. It's very focused on psychology and sociology and behavior. The other 2 sections, chemical and physical foundations and biological and biochemical foundations, do have a lot of overlap between biology, biochemistry, and general chemistry. So that's just something to kind of be wary of. The one thing I will say is that if you do end up having physics questions, it will be on the first section, the chemical and physical foundations. Um, so that's just something I like to think about is if you're going to get physics questions, it'll probably be in that first section. And once you are done with that first section, you can throw out all of those physics equations that you have memorized, all of that sort of information, and things like that. And so I will say that the breaks also say that they're optional. Please take them. Do not try to sit through this entire test for 6 hours and 15 minutes, even if you're not hungry, even if you're not thirsty, even if you don't have to go to the bathroom. Give your brain a break, stand up and walk around and just sort of mentally change into the next section so you guys can be ready. And throughout this, if any of the other medical students here want to say something or have an anecdote to just go ahead and let me know and you can sort of chime in. Um, Great. So we just talked about those 4 sections. Each of those 4 sections are scored individually on a scale between 118 and 132. And those 4 scores from each of those sections are added together to give you a final score range of 472 to 528. The thing that I will say is that each of these test sections have equal weight. So don't just focus on the science portions, the psychology portions. Try to get all of the information that you can, because schools will be able to see the specific score sections as well. And they'll weight those equally. So even if you do have a great score, if there's one section that's a little bit lower than others or sort of not within that average, that does say something about your score. So keep that in mind when you're actually taking this test and studying for it. And it's also good information for when you do your practice test and you get your scores. You can see if there are certain sections that are more difficult for you, whether that be knowledge-based or timing-based. So like, for example, when I took the MCAT a few years ago, my lowest score was psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. And I studied a lot for that. I knew a lot of the information, but that is the last section that you do. And by that time, I was very tired and very over sitting in a chair taking this exam, and that probably impacted my score a little bit. So that's what I would say about that is the MCAT is a marathon. It's just as much about the content as it is about the difficulty with the timing and things like that. So keep that in mind. Just knowing all the information isn't going to get you through it. And on the right side here, if you were at the last session, we talked about MSAR, which I don't know what it stands for, but it is a database online of all the medical schools in the US and information about them, including acceptance rates and the average MCAT scores for applicants and matriculants. So you can go ahead and look at that before. If there's a school that you really want to get into or you're really interested in, you can go look at the average MCAT score for that school, as well as the individual section scores, which you can see on the right. And the blue bars, the center score is the average, the blue bars is the 25% below and above, and then 75% below and above, I think. So that's just a good way to kind of gauge exactly what kind of score you're going to be shooting for, if there are certain schools that you're going for. And it's also, once you do get your score back, it's helpful for creating that list of schools that you're going to apply to with your score in mind and with that range in mind. Does anybody want to add anything just kind of about like overview of the MCAT before we move on? No? Great. Okay. So these are the average scores for 2023 and 2024 between applicants and matriculants to medical schools here. Each individual section is not that interesting. It's all around the same. You can see which ones are the hardest and which ones are the most difficult. I would say CARS is the most difficult. That was my own sort of experience as well, just because it is so different from science. It's like just reading comprehension and things like that. And the passages are very long. Timing is very hard on that section, which is kind of why it's one of the most difficult. I don't know if other people agree or disagree, but that was definitely the hardest one. And then you can kind of see the averages of your total MCATs. The average score for all applicants is 506, and the average score for matriculants is 511.7. And I just want to reiterate what I said before. This is just one part of your application. It is not the end all be all. If you score below the average matriculation score, it doesn't mean you're not going to get in. And if you score above it, it does not guarantee that you're going to get in. So please keep that in mind as you're studying, as you get your scores back. Your chances of getting in and your strength as an applicant are not defined by this one number. And on the right, you can see the average GPAs for applicants and matriculants based on their college grades, and the difference between the science GPA and the non-science GPA. When you enter all of your classes and grades in AMCAS, when you're filling out the application, you will mark which courses are science courses and which ones are non-science courses. And based on that, the AAMC will calculate what your science GPA is and what your non-science GPA is. So it's standardized and it's not school specific. And we can talk more about that when we get into the primary application sessions and things like that. Great. So the timeline for registration, I know this says 2023, but I am pretty sure this is the 2024 schedule, and it just wasn't, that 2023 just wasn't changed to 2024. But if you Google 2024 MCAT dates and go to the AAMC website. They will be there. And you can see when you'll take the test and when the score will be released. It's always about a month in between for your score to be released. So I would say, okay, yeah, Lauren said it's the updated 2024 schedule. It's just a typo. Dates are offered from January to September. We talked about the timeline in the last session. Just remember that the application opens in May, at the end of May, and then you can submit starting at the end of June. And secondaries interviews are sort of July through December in the new year. So keep that in mind when you're choosing what times to take the test, whether or not you want to have the option to retake it before you fill out the application, and things like that. And the other thing too is you can retake the MCAT after you have submitted that application to different schools. But just keep in mind the schools might not review it, they might not see it, or they might wait until you get your score back and send them the updated score. So just keep those in mind when you're deciding when to take it. But the most important thing for when you're deciding to take it is when you're going to be ready. Just because you're like, I want to take it before I fill out the primary application, I'm going to take it in May. But if you're not ready to take it in May, don't take it in May. Make sure that that is, you can steady until that time and be prepared. The cost is $335, which is just a truth about applying to medical school. There's a cost associated with everything. There is a fee assistance program, which I think there's a little bit of information at the end of this presentation. You can apply for it every year and it will cover the cost of your MCAT registration. And I don't know if it covers a practice test. I thought it used to, but if someone knows the answer to that, please chime in. Like I said before, sign up as early as you can once you decide when a good date is for you. And 10 days before is the last day that you can schedule an exam. I don't think that that is that relevant because most of the time the testing dates based on where you live will fill up way before then. And like I said, ideally take it early in the year before you kind of start that primary application process, but only if you're ready. If you think you need more time, wait. It is much better to wait and take it for the first time rather than take it early and not be prepared and get a worse score. So now we're kind of going to go into questions. The science portions of the exam, so the 3 sections, the everything but cars, basically, are mostly passage-based questions. And so what that looks like is you will get a passage. Sometimes they'll have graphs. Sometimes they won't have graphs. They'll just be words and paragraphs. And there will be 4 to 7 questions on that passage. Sometimes you need outside information to answer questions. Sometimes it's all contained within the passage. And there's about 8 passages per section. And so breaking up that timing, it's like, I don't remember how many minutes it is per passage. But you will have 4 answer choices per question, or yeah, 4 answer choices per question. So this is an example. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. I honestly probably wouldn't even be able to get it right. And then, so these are the passage-based questions for the science portions. These are the passage-based questions for cars, which cars is much more dense. And as I said before, there is no outside information that you need for cars. You don't need to like read up on philosophy, read up on things like that. All that information is always going to be there. And the questions and passages are exactly the same as the science ones. So cars is the hardest. You get access to the MCAT official prep bundle with the fee assistance. Okay. Thank you, Lauren, for looking that up. And then within the science sections as well, there are standalone questions. And so those will just kind of be interspersed in between passages. So you will have a passage on your left side of the screen, you'll answer 4 questions. And once you're done with that passage, sometimes we'll get like 3 or 4 standalone questions. And those are just multiple choice questions like before. There will be no context for it. There might be information in other passages throughout the test that might help you, but they're really meant just to be answered sort of on your own. And the other thing I will say that I didn't say before is that with passages, Once you finish one, you can go back within that section if you have extra time, if you end up skipping a couple questions on one passage or skipping a passage entirely just because it's something you don't really know or something you didn't study, that's completely okay. Once you finish a section, you are able to go back to that section and those passages. So keep that in mind when you're developing your test taking strategy, when you're developing your timing, and you're practicing whether you need to skip questions or not, or skip passages. So this is an example of a standalone question. This is another example of a standalone question, and I want to use this as an opportunity just to kind of like talk about test taking strategies and things like that, as just sort of an example. So like if you look at this, which is the following is true regarding bipolar disorders, if you just read number one, they have little genetic irritability, and let's say that that's false, that there is quite a big genetic component, we can instantly cross out one. And if you go down and look at the answers, you can cross out one, you can cross out A and you can cross out C. And if you look at your two options left, you see that Roman numeral 2 is in both of them. So you don't even need to read about that. You don't even need to care about that. Cross it out and just look at number 3 to make your decision on what is the correct answer. So that's just one of the ways that you can sort of make the test easier for yourself, whether it be through test taking strategies, because just knowing all the content is not going to get you through it. If anybody else here has like other test taking strategies that they've used, questions like that they want to chime in on, feel free to, if any personal anecdotes and things like that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say one good thing that Spencer brought up was the timing aspect of things too, that we didn't really touch on so much in the slides, but timing is a big part of like your test taking strategy for the day of too, especially like you said with cars. And so that's something that's kind of like hard for us to walk you through, but that's something that you kind of pick up with those practice exams that you take or those question bundles where you're doing just a section of psych or something like that. And that's where you can build those skills for your timing, because that's another big aspect is not only like knowing the content that's going to be on the test itself, but also making sure that you can get to as many questions as possible or have time to review if that's your strategy, especially with those big passage-based ones, like you could see with the cars passage, those are pretty big. And so those are going to take some strategy to be able to get through. But otherwise, these are just like good examples of kind of the different types of facts you'll have to learn about with like, this is more of a psych-based question. There's just asking about like definition of bipolar disorder. The other questions were more science-based and kind of like what's an antibody or how do you apply this to this passage. So kind of a good variety of different things you might see on the test.
Thank you, Lauren. Jacob or Austin, anything you want to add?
Kind of expanding on the process of elimination, I feel like that's like probably one of the most powerful tools you can use, and not just like those Roman numerals, but really in any of those questions. Your mileage may vary with like different types of questions, but I found for more so the science ones, less so cars, but even if it's just like a simple like 4 answer response, some for some of the questions that were say not as complicated, I found it was helpful to like skim the passage, making sure I don't miss important details, but kind of speed read it. And then kind of knowing what the question's asking, eliminate any answers I know outright are wrong. And then with the remaining answers, kind of like read through the passage again and see if there are like answers hidden, like answers included in the passage, or at least like if I have to make an educated guess, I'm able to at least, make an educated guess between 2 choices rather than 4. So process of elimination really is your best friend for this. It's not even.
Yes, I will say that. I will echo that figuring out how you're going to get through passages is the best thing for your timing. And like Austin said, there are so many different ways to approach it. The most important thing is that you find the way that is good for you and you practice it and you stick to it. So whether that be you read all the questions first and then go back through the passage, you skim the passage first, then read the questions, or you read through the entire passage and then go through the questions, figuring out what works for you, figuring out what is best timing wise is a great thing to do early on in your studying. So you can develop your test taking strategy. You can develop exactly how you're going to take this test so it's not a surprise or it's not something you have to worry about when you actually take the exam. Because all those things you should be able to figure out. So you're just kind of focused on answering the questions rather than being like, okay, how am I going to approach this? And the other thing that I said earlier about skipping passages, if they're too hard, you can also skip passages if they're too easy. If you know that it's only going to take you 5-6 minutes to get through this passage, go ahead and skip those questions, do the other ones first, and then go back when you have about 5 minutes left and just get that one done. Sometimes people like to look for all the standalone questions or things like that. There are so many different ways to do it. So early on in your studying, figure out what you like, figure out what works for you, try a couple different things, and then find that and stick to it as you go through it. And that's also true for cars. Each section is going to be a little bit different. Everyone's going to have different sections that they're comfortable with, different topics that you're comfortable with. I remember on my I think it was on the first section, the physical and chemical section of my MCAT, there was a passage that was something I had never studied. I had never, like, I didn't even know what it was. And so I just completely skipped that one and I did all the other ones first. And I had like 9 or 10 minutes left at the end of that section. And I went back and I read that passage and I did my best to answer the questions just based on the information in the passage, which wasn't enough. But I knew that if I started with that one, it would take up too much of my time and hurt myself on the other passages. And two, it would probably just kind of kill my confidence for the entire section because I wouldn't feel good about it. So I just kind of said, screw it, I'll focus on the other ones. Like that, I'll get what I can out of that really difficult one for me. So that is going to happen. You can't know exactly what is going to be on the test. It will not cover everything you need to know. It will be random passages. It will be very annoying. You will memorize like 100 physics equations, and there might not be a single physics passage or physics question on the entire exam. But that's just kind of the nature of it. If you guys have any questions about sort of like passages and things like that, I'll talk a little bit more about time management and preparing and how to figure that out in a little bit. But feel free to put any questions you have in the chat or unmute yourself and talk.
And then also going off what you just said, Spencer, that like I think a big part of the mindset with the MCAT is very much of like you kind of have to what losses you can and just like take whatever you can get and then be okay with like not knowing things. Like educated guesses are absolutely acceptable on the MCAT. It's impossible to know all the answers to every single question, and like it's straight up impossible. Like it's not that you didn't study hard enough. If there are things where you're guessing, that's totally fine. That's normal. So like a big part of the mindset for me when I was studying for the MCAT was shifting away from I need to know everything to I need to be okay with, you know, just eliminating a few answer choices and making a guess between the two and then moving on to the next question instead of agonizing over like, what is my best choice? Am I absolutely certain it's the right one? So it's like, you have to kind of adopt an attitude like cut your losses and move.
Definitely. And like this question that's on the screen right now, I know one is false, so I can get rid of A and C. Two doesn't matter because it's in both. And let's say I look at three and I'm like, I have no idea. I've already narrowed it down to two. That's a 50-50 shot. Don't try to pull out information that you didn't study on the test and it's not going to come up anywhere. Take a guess and move on. You have a 50-50 shot. That's pretty good. You narrowed it down from 4 to 2. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about studying for the MCAT. The most important thing is practice exams and questions by far. Those are the best way to understand how the test is going to ask you questions. And it's also a good way to learn the information that they want you to know. Also, I think the kind of passage format that we've talked about is relatively unique. It's not something that I experienced a lot when I was an undergrad. And so getting comfortable with that is the best thing that you can do. There are so many free options online, whether that be through Kaplan, the AAMC, or the Princeton Review, or the fee, and through the fee assistance program, you do get some access to that. I think the AAMC QBanks and practice exams are like a very good deal if you get an 8-hour exam to practice for $35. There are also paid online courses that I'm sure everyone has heard about, whether that be Kaplan or Princeton Review. They are extremely expensive. They are helpful, but they are not necessary. If you're someone who struggles to sort of set goals and set timelines and you don't really want to do that and you have the financial capability of getting these paid online courses, they will give you like a step-by-step, day-by-day based on your um, exam date when you enter it and your score. They will plan out your entire thing for you of how many hours you want to study a day, how many days a week, and things like that. So if that's something you think you might struggle with, you can consider getting those online courses. There are also Princeton Review and Kaplan also has like textbook sets between all the different sections and things like that. You can buy them new. Each year they'll update them. You can also buy used ones, which is what I did. I bought a used Princeton Review set from like the cycle before me, so it was like a little bit outdated, but I found it very helpful. It was much cheaper than buying it new and things like that. So go ahead and just like, also if you have friends that have already taken it, that are in medical school, ask them what they used, ask them if they have anything, what tips they have, and go ahead and go off of that. Because just spending $2,000 on Princeton Review just because you think it's the best way for you to study is not going to be that helpful. If you think that you can get a lot out of it, you need that plan, you need that structure or the opportunity to talk to tutors or a one-on-one time, go ahead and look at the different options like that. But it is certainly possible to study and be successful on this exam completely on your own without having to pay all this money for outside resources. The other thing you can do is flashcards, Anki, and Quizlets. There are, again, a plethora of options out on the internet that can help you. Spaced repetition is the best ways to learn and retain information, whether that's through Anki, which kind of does the spaced repetition for you, or you kind of determine that I'm going to do these different Quizlets or make my own paper flashcards. Looking at them over the long term with different amounts of time in between is a really good way to sort of retain information. There are also pre-made decks for Anki, pre-made Quizlets, all over Student Doctor Network and other websites like that. So keep those in mind. Again, there is no one right way. If you like flashcards, if they have helped you in undergrad, go ahead and use them for the MCAT. If they are terrible, you don't find them helpful, don't change what you're doing for the MCAT if it hasn't worked for you before. It's not going to magically start working. So early on in your study plan, try a bunch of different things, see what's great, see what you like, what is interesting to you, what you can do for long periods of time, and then sort of focus in on those things as well. There are also podcasts. If you're like listening to things personally, I don't like podcasts. If I'm just listening to something, I don't have like a visualization of what's going on and it's not going to stick. Like I said before, there are paid tutoring options, both sort of through big companies like Princeton Review and Kaplan, but also just small places based on where you go to school, if you have other friends in medical school and things like that. Also, if you struggle motivating yourself and sitting alone in your room studying, find someone who's also taking the MCAT that is a friend and you can study with and you can motivate each other. There are also like online groups that do like Zooms and things to study, whether that just be you're sitting there in front of a screen and it's just so you can motivate each other and keep each other accountable for studying, or you like people want to talk about it. I remember studying during COVID that these were like all the rage. So many people did them. Some people like literally just sat there listening to music for 8 hours on a Zoom, and other people would talk and sort of like study as a group. So keep that in mind as well. So just kind of like a couple pearls and things like that is decide on a goal for your score early. At the same time you decide on a date that you're going to take the exam, whether that be 515, 512, whatever it is. You can sort of determine that score based on using MSAR or looking at like averages for the schools that you're looking at and things like that. Make it a goal, make it something that you're going to work towards. That way you can gauge exactly where you are when you take that first practice exam. So if I set a goal to get a 515 and my first practice exam, I get a 508, there are 8 points that I need to find. And you can look at the different sections and say, all right, I can get, right, I'm already at like 129 out of 132 on the sociology section. So there's not a lot of room in there. If there's more room in the cars section, you can kind of help determine your study plan that way and be like, I need to focus on cars because that's where I can kind of get those points to get to my goal. And just like that, take a practice test early to gauge where you're at. You don't need to be studying 3 months before you take your first practice test. Go ahead and buy one on the AAMC, or if they have full-length practice tests with the study plan that you bought, take one early. Figure out exactly where you are and the sort of information and things that you need to sort of learn over the whatever timeline you have. The other thing that's really great about taking a practice test early is you get a feel for what the test is like and what the questions are like. So if that is like, I have no idea how to do like time management with these passages, that's something I need to work on. You need to figure that out early so you can work on that. If you find that the last section you are just completely burnt out, you cannot focus, your eyes are burning from staring at a screen, that's something you're going to have to work on building stamina, whether that is taking more practice tests or just studying for that period of time when you're not feeling good and stuff like that. The most important thing about full-length practice exams is doing them in one sitting and acting like it is the real test. So doing it at the time that you're going to take it. I know there are morning slots and afternoon slots for the MCAT. Whichever one you end up signing up for, start those full-length practice exams at the exact same time that you're going to actually start that exam. Set a timer, stick to it for each section. If you're going to take a break, set a timer for 15 minutes. Don't look at your phone in between because you're not allowed to look at your phone on those breaks. Practice sleeping, practice like how much you need to sleep the night before, when you need to wake up beforehand, what you're going to do on the breaks. I would literally try to simulate everything I could about the exam, whether that's not looking at my phone, figuring out what I was going to eat, if I needed to go to the bathroom, things like that, just so I can get a better idea of exactly what it's going to feel like on the day. So there's no surprises with that. The other thing I would do is they give you like a little sort of like dry erase pad that is your scratch paper for the exam. And it's erased between every section, so practice that, but also just writing on it. It's not the same as writing as like with a nice pen. It's much messier. It gets all over the place. Stuff gets erased. You can buy one on Amazon for like $4 or $5. Go ahead and get one and practice that way, just so you kind of know exactly what that's like. And the other thing is all of the Pearson centers use like PCs. So if you are using a laptop and you have a trackpad, practice with a mouse. If you have one, you can get them at stores for like less than $10 or online for less than $10. Go ahead and take it with a mouse and figure out how you're going to use that. How do you highlight things like that? How do you strike through answers? How do you navigate the test? All of those things are super important in getting ready for the exam. It's not just doing questions. And then the last part on this slide is reviewing your practice exams. Going through the questions you got wrong obviously is very important because you got those questions wrong, but also go through the questions that you got right. Go through your thought process of how you got that question right and whether or not you can apply it to other questions. And the other thing I will say is, like, going back to this question here, if I get this question right, I should be able to justify why I got that right answer, how I chose it. But another great way to study is to look at these options and figure out why you know the other three are wrong. Those are great ways to learn more information and to figure out exactly where you have knowledge gaps and things like that. Because just knowing the right answer sometimes isn't enough. You need to know why the other answers are wrong. And the other thing too, like Austin said before, there are going to be times when you don't know the answer and stuff like that. And the thing is, though, if you don't know the right answer, you might know 2 or 3 options that you know are wrong, that are just not true. And that is a great way to knock out answers, knock out answer choices, and have 1 to 2 options left. So just think about that when you're reviewing the questions. Don't look just for the right answer. Also decide why other answers are wrong. And yeah, like Lauren said in the chat, there are plenty of different ways to like highlight, take notes on questions, flag questions, go back and review, flag passages, things like that. Mess around with it, figure out what you like to do. Again, I don't recommend highlighting the entire thing. It's not very helpful. If you want to highlight numbers, stuff like that, things you can do. Also, another thing that I did specifically on the first section with the physics portions, I always say there was a bunch of physics equations you needed to memorize. I had like a thing that I would like practice writing out. And so as soon as that thing started, I just took that little whiteboard and I just like scribbled out what I had practiced scribbling out multiple times. So I had that information. I just got it out of my head and it was there if I needed it. I didn't have to pull it up right away. I had a friend who did that for the amino acids. They memorized like the 20 sort of like 1 letter, 2 letter abbreviations, and they just spit that out on the whiteboard when they started. So they had that information if they needed it. And it wasn't something they had to just go ahead and sort of recall every time it came up. It was right there. So if that's something you think you might benefit from, go ahead and practice that. Other pearls of wisdoms, I think I've said this probably like 12 times. Make a study plan and stick to it. Again, once you decide when that date is, figure out, okay, how many days of the week am I going to study? What's my schedule look like? If you're still in school, it's going to be hard to sort of find time at the start and manage things with your midterm exams and stuff like that. It's certainly possible. People do it all the time. But having that long-term plan, being like, okay, I know in 4 weeks I'm going to have midterms. So that week I'm not going to be able to study a lot. So maybe the week after or a couple weeks before, I'm going to dedicate some more time for that. And the other thing I would say is in your study plan, don't just build in time to study, build in time to do things for fun and whatever you find fulfilling, whether that is finding time to go to the gym, reading a book, watching TV, whatever it is. Build that into your study schedule so you can make yourself stick to it just as much as you make yourself stick to studying for other things. Super important to be able to take care of yourself and stay healthy during this process because it is a very long marathon. Another great thing is drive to the test site beforehand. I did this. It was like a 25-minute drive for me. I drove at the time that I needed to drive for the test so I could see, is there going to be morning traffic? Is there not going to be traffic? Stuff like that. Look for the parking because, sometimes there might be street parking. You might need to pay for parking, things like that. You can just check and see exactly what's going on and stuff like that. And I know I've mentioned a bunch of different things about like knowing what the test looks like, knowing what the mouse is like, what the testing room looks like, things like that. All of those things are super helpful because it sort of reduces stress and reduces the unknowns on the test. So when you actually get to your test day, the only thing that is new and you have to worry about is the information on the exam. Everything else is already set. You know how long you have, you know how much you need to drive, you know what you're going to eat, you know if you need to drink water, things like that. If you're going to stand up and take a 10-minute break instead of a 20-minute break, all of those things are decided upon. And it just kind of removes that cognitive load and that stress on actual test day. The other thing is that your MCAT score is going to remain valid for 2 to 4 years. It varies based on the school that you apply to. Some take MCAT scores from 4 years ago. Some will take MCAT scores from 3 years ago, 2 years ago. So keep that in mind when you're developing your test list and when you take it and whether or not you take gap years and stuff like that. Know how long those scores are going to be valid for because I would hate for you to get to an application cycle and realize that your score is not valid. Anybody has any personal anecdotes about how they studied? Feel free to chime in.
I just wanted to reiterate what Spencer said about like studying with like self-studying versus like buying a like structured tutored thing. I definitely didn't have the money to like put out for one of those like $2,000, $3,000 MCAT study courses. And so like just reassuring you guys that it's like possible to do independent studying. I just bought a Kaplan like a Kaplan set for the content for the MCAT, and I studied that. It's really good if you can kind of set like an entire schedule. So like start to finish every day what you're going to do. Personally, what I actually like to do, which I know some people that I talked to did it differently, is I like to study a different subject every day. Instead of doing like instead of trying to finish like the entire OChem book or the entire Gen Chem book, I thought it was nice to study like a different subject every day, because in reality, the MCAT it rarely actually tests topics in isolation. Often they'll throw in like something bio related with something physics, or they'll throw something like psych related with like statistics. So like it's definitely in your best interest to like learn these topics and how they relate to each other. So that's a little piece of advice I would give. And just, yeah, be diligent with your studying. Like Spencer said, questions are really helpful. Personally, flashcards didn't work for me just because it's like there's so much formulas that it's like I couldn't remember nearly all of them. And so like I think that's something that doing questions helps, is that you can kind of see what formulas are actually important and will come up, and which formulas are like really niche and like probably less likely to show up on test day. But yeah, this test is definitely like a test of learning how to take it as opposed to like actually mastering the content. So don't get discouraged if it feels like you don't know things, or yeah, if you take tests and you don't get as good of a score as you'd like. And then final piece of advice is, when I took it, I think there was 4 AAMC like practice tests. Try to take those ones, because those are from the same, organization that makes the actual MCAT. So like in my opinion, those were the closest to the actual test day questions. And I took 4 of them, and the last score that I got on the practice test was the same score that I got in my real test. And so it was pretty indicative of like how I was actually performing. So yeah, that's my spiel.
Yeah, definitely the AAMC practice tests are the most representative. Also, what Austin said in the chat, do not be disheartened by your first score when you haven't studied at all and you take that first one. I got on my first practice exam, I got like a 476, which is like 4 points away from the lowest score possible. So don't be disheartened by that. It's just a way to sort of maintain your growth and see how far you've come and see what you need to work on. The other thing I would say about with Jacob is it is really important to sort of like study a bunch of random like topics in between, like whether it be physics, chemistry, biology. The thing that I would do that kind of just goes back to like practicing those full length exams is I would set timers. So I would study biology and chemistry and physics for like an hour and 20 minutes. Then I would go do cars for an hour and 20 minutes. Like my brain just got kind of used to the order of what I would have to do on the actual exam day. And then I would do like an hour of more chem and physics and then an hour of psychology. That was something that I did. I found that very helpful because it just kind of got my brain into like know what to expect. But again, figure out what works for you. Try a bunch of different things early. Said about this earlier, you get your scores 30 to 35 days after taking it. And you, like I said before, your application will be processed without a score, or if there's a pending score, it will still be processed, but it probably won't be reviewed until you have that score sent out. And that also kind of goes into verification of your application, which is a whole other thing that we'll talk about in upcoming sessions. But it's just something to keep in mind as you go through it. Yeah, and the other thing too is don't like schedule a second test like within a month or within 2 months. Wait until you get your scores back to see even if you need to like, if you want to retake it or not. Don't just be like walking out of the exam like, oh my God, I did terrible, I need to retake it. Give yourself some time, give yourself some grace, take a little bit of time off. So regards, moving on from that, sort of retaking the MCAT. It's a hard question. I will certainly say people do retake it and get a lot better, but no matter what, every school will be able to see every attempt that you've made on the MCAT and every score. I think you have 8 lifetime attempts and like 3 within a year or something. But just know that no matter what you get, how many times you take it, every school is going to see every single one of those scores, which is also why it's important to only take the test when you're ready. Also, if you wanted like a 515 and you get a 514, ask yourself, is that 1 point really, really going to matter? Especially if you do worse on the second one. because that is definitely not as important, or not as a good look. It's great if you like get better, do better, a couple points better, but it looks not great if you do a couple points worse. So just keep that in mind. Also, with the whole verification process, if you can't find a time to take it again, you might have to wait a whole nother year, and it's a long application cycle. It's also another $335. It's also another time commitment for studying and things like that. And again, for the third time, you are more than your MCAT score. It is not the end of the world if you don't get exactly what you want. Some schools do super score, so they will take your best exam score and sort of add it all together to give you your best MCAT score out of all your attempts. I don't know what schools do that. Very few do that, but it is something to keep in mind. Again, retaking it is not a very simple yes or no question. If you do really poorly, you can retake it. It's not going to make you look bad, but don't just take it like within a month after getting your score back. If you don't do well, again, remake that study plan, figure out what your weakness was, whether it was a certain section, whether it was fatigue after taking an 8-hour exam, and focus on that and focus on improving that, because that's really where you're going to find those changes in between those two exams. And at the start, I didn't mention this, but at the end of the MCAT, there is a little question that is like, do you want to avoid this exam? There are like 99% of the time you should never even think about clicking yes, because you won't even get a score. You won't even know what you got. The only time is if something really terrible happens, like you get super sick on exam day, or you have a really bad anxiety attack or something like that, and it definitely like took away from your performance. If you just feel bad about the test, get the score, and then you can see what you get, and whether or not you have to retake it. Because also, if you hit void, you're voiding a $335 test score. So keep that in mind. So overall, before we kind of finish up, I'm going to say it again. Your MCAT score is not the only thing that determines your acceptance. The application is like 17 pages long with so many different essays and activities. Your MCAT score is 5 lines of that. Please do not think that you're going to get in or get denied based on your MCAT score. There are plenty of people at CU that have great scores and people that have scores below the average. Averages are averages. And last but not least, there is not one correct way to study. I know I have said what I've done and what was successful for me. It was extremely different from what Jacob just said, different from what Austin said, different from what Lauren said. So when you go online and look at like ways to study and stuff like that, if you see someone, oh, I got a 528, or your friend said, I got a 522 doing this, doing flashcards, and you know flashcards aren't for you, don't be like, oh, I have to do this because it's the best way. It's how this other person got that score. Everybody here is in undergrad, working through those classes, or gone through it. You know what works for you. You just have to figure out how you're going to create a schedule for the MCAT using those things that work for you. So please keep that in mind. There is not one right way to do it. We talked about the MCAT fee assistant program. You can apply once every year, and you will get the registration fee discount. You'll get prep tests and things like that, and you'll get a waiver for 1 year of application submission and things like that. You can go ahead and look all of this up on the AAMC website. If you think that you'll qualify, it's definitely very helpful. So yeah, keep that in mind. Applying to medical school and taking these exams is not cheap. Just a little plug for an upcoming session. If you feel like you still have a lot of questions, or you just want more information about the MCAT, there is another webinar next Monday at 6 p.m. That you can listen to as well if you do have more questions or want to learn more about it and get a different perspective. Just like before, there's so many different ways to approach this exam. So taking in more information is always better to help you sort of determine what's going to be best for you. This is just a list of resources of things that I've talked about beforehand. All of those things like MSAR are on here. These slides will be posted. This recording will be posted. So you don't need to write all this down right now. Yeah. And so if you did that pre-session survey, here's the link to the post-session survey. Please fill that out. Thank you guys all for coming. I know probably a lot of you are close to finals week or currently in finals week in wherever you go to school. So taking time out of your day to think about yet another exam that you have to study for. Really appreciate all of you guys coming.